and I'm the research director here at the Elling Eye Center. On behalf of the staff, I want to welcome everyone to the fourth lecture in our Florida Scholars Speaker Series. We developed this lecture series to highlight the academic research from our state in areas that were of scholarly and personal interest to Mr. Elling Eye. Those areas include the languages, literature, and cultures of East Asia, as well as the diverse cultures of Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. His passion for the vast history of this region is reflected in the extensive holdings of the center's library. The 72 acres on which this library stands reflects Elling's deep interest in horticulture, ecology, and the natural environment of Little Sarasota Bay and Florida more generally, while Elling's fascination with the cultures of indigenous people from the American Southeast can be seen in his endowment of a position in the University of Florida's Department of Anthropology, dedicated to the study of the languages of Florida's native people. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Manuel Lopez, Associate Professor of Religion at the New College of Florida, who has just received tenure. Dr. Lopez received his PhD from the University of Virginia. He studied Tibetan and Chinese language, as well as Buddhism and Tibetan literature at Northwest Minorities University in Lanzhou, Gansu Province, and at Tibet University in Lhasa in the Tibetan Autonomous Region. He did some field research for his dissertation at Zhongyang Minzidashui, the Central University for Nationalities in Beijing. His current research focuses on changes in the monastic curriculum that have taken place in the Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan in the last few decades, but he is also interested in the intersection of religion and popular culture. His recent courses include, and these are all sound like just amazing classes to take, Buddhism for Beginners, The Buddha, His Quest for Enlightenment, and the Rise of Global Religion, Zombies, Handmaids, and Superheroes, Religion and Popular Culture, Buddhist Scriptures, and Emperors, Monks, and Samurais, Introduction to Japanese Religions, just to name a few of the interesting titles of his courses. His lecture today is titled, A Monk and a Nun Walk into a Monastery, Contemporary Religious Education in Bhutan. So please help me to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Lopez.
Well, thanks, Matthew, for your kind words and for the invitation to speak at this great little gem of an institution, the Eye Center. I also want to thank everyone for coming here. I know it's not always the easiest thing to do over the last 2 years to venture out, so I really appreciate it. And I want to also thank those who are online watching. So today, I want to talk about monastic education in Bhutan. So basically what monks and nuns learn in monasteries and nunneries in the country. And I want to discuss the remarkable transformation of monastic education in the country over the last 40 years or so, and in particular, the different challenges that monks and nuns face when having access to that education, which, as we will see, there's sort of these parallel tracks, parallel paths, but also divergent due to the gender challenges in terms of having access to education. This talk is based on research that I have done over the last few years with my colleague, Professor Dorje Gelsen, who you can see there. He was a former monk and now is a professor at the Jigme Singh Wanchuk School of Law. And over the last few years, we've, before the pandemic, obviously, we would spend summers together going to all sorts of monasteries and nunneries and spend time with monks and nuns and teachers and scholars and officials of the government and the central monastic body, trying to piece together the history and the changes of monastic education in time. So I want to thank everyone, particularly Dorje, for all the help, but also everyone who has talked to us and informed us in our research. So let me start just by asking quickly, so how many of you have been to Bhutan? So some of you. So when was the last time you were there?
2019.
2019.
Let's see.
A while ago, 2019, so not long ago. Was it like pleasure, or were you doing anything?
Pleasure.
Travel? Okay. So some of you are familiar with the country, so I'm just giving a little bit of a background because I don't want to assume. But most people have heard of Bhutan as sort of Shangri-La. This is a Bhutan PBS from not that long ago. It's the last Shangri-La, right? And a lot of the ideas about Bhutan is this sort of modern version of Shangri-La, a paradise on earth where people have preserved a traditional form of living and has mostly been untouched by the modern world. Anyone who has been there, though, knows that this is not true. And this vision of the country has more to do with Orientalist visions of Bhutan, fueled by narratives like this famous book from 1933, The Novel Lost Horizon by James Hilton, than by reality. Bhutan, though, has not been completely innocent since promotes this vision of the country for tourism purposes, right? Bhutan Free, explore mystical Bhutan. And also through unique policies, probably the most famous one, the idea of gross national happiness instead of gross national product or gross domestic product, which is one of the most famous, unique kind of quote-unquote economic policies of Bhutan. The uniqueness of Bhutan is also reinforced by Bhutanese policies like the official dress code, which requires all men and women to wear traditional attire, what's called ago and akira, if they work in government offices or school, or when they have formal occasions like entering official buildings, monasteries, and temples. The country seems to be constantly negotiating this tension between tradition and modernity, although I think it's probably more accurate to phrase it in terms of a tension between a strong sense of cultural identity and national identity that is seen as threatened by powerful neighbors, right? You have India in the south, China in the north, and also this cultural, quote-unquote, threat of the vague West, right? So you can see actually a lot of the things that I'm talking about, these tensions, in a film that was just nominated. This is the first Bhutanese film nominated for Best Foreign Film at the Oscars this year. So you can find this online. And the film is Lunana and Yak in the Classroom. And the film tells the story of a school teacher who in his final year of training goes to this very remote area in the north called Lunana and is confronted with this sort of quote-unquote backwards like people, and he's away from the comforts of Thimphu, the capital, and like no internet, and but at the end of the film, he sort of comes to recognize what it's probably the not so subtle message of the movie, that these people who live in the north are also the essence of the culture of Bhutan. So, problematic, but it's a cute film. It's a good film. I recommend it. This sense of uniqueness and isolation is also the result of strategic decisions, like their tourism policy. So Bhutan, and if you travel there, has pursued a strategy what they call low volume, high value, low volume tourism, which basically means if a tourist wants to go there, they have to pay these very high fees every day, all inclusive, but it could be up to $250 in high season, $200 on the low season, which means a lot of tourists cannot spend a lot of time there because it's very expensive. Which also means a lot of tourists don't get to really see much of the country, because by the time you get to the Thimphu, Paro, Thimphu, or Bhutan, the center of the country, you have to other countries, particularly India and Nepal. I lived for 6 years in Nepal, very close to Bhutan, and it's difficult to argue that if you let the doors completely open to tourism, there's going to be a cultural impact, right? So they're trying to avoid that. So after all, these concerns are relevant because Bhutan is a very small country of barely 750,000 people nested in the middle of the Himalayas, surrounded by these big, powerful neighbors, India in the south and China in the north. Just to give a little bit of context, right? Bhutan, as we mostly know it today, is the product of, it became unified in the 17th century under the figure of the Shadru Manuel, who was a Tibetan religious figure who escaped Tibet, a religious conflict in Tibet, and settled and established himself in Bhutan and became the political and religious leader of the country. Establishing what it was basically a theocratic state where the political power and religious power was unified under a series of reincarnate figures known as the Shadrus, right? This changed in the early 20th century, in 1907 to be precise, when Bhutan became a monarchy, where all the power rested in the hands of the king, the first one being Ugi Wanchuk. And in 2007, the country gave another big change where it became a constitutional democracy, with the king as the head of the state, and the country governed by means of a parliamentary democracy. Their current king is the fifth king. It's Jigme Kesar Namga Wanchuk, and you can follow the Queen Instagram if you wish to do so. I was actually at the time of the election for the first election, I was in Bhutan, and it was a very exciting time. Everyone was trying to figure out what democracy is going to do to the country, how is it going to affect, and it's been an interesting process. In terms of the religious landscape, Bhutan is officially a Buddhist nation, but it has a significant amount of Hindu population, what they call the Hotsampas, which can be between 20 and 25%, so not insignificant, while the remaining 75% of the population are Buddhist. Now, from the outside, it might look like it's all Buddhist, but when you look closely, and this is important, there's two different Buddhist traditions in Bhutan for the most part. One is the Drukpa Kagyu, which became the official and state religion of Bhutan with the arrival of the Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyel in the 17th century. And currently all Drukpa Kagyu monasteries, which are the majority, are centralized under the control of the central monastic body and under the leadership of this hierarchy called the Jekem, right? And that's important because that means that all Drukpa Kagyu monasteries are hierarchically controlled from the top down. So whatever changes come from the top, they spread to all monasteries, right? It's policy. The other important tradition is the Nyingma tradition. And the Nyingma tradition goes all the way back to the 7th century. There's a long history of small monasteries who are part of this tradition. But most of the Nyingma monasteries in the country are run by independent, charismatic teachers, lamas, and do not receive funds from the central monastic body, so they're not controlled by the government, and do not follow the rules and regulations. And this is important, this dichotomy is important, because as we will see, the changes that are happening in the country have happened at different speeds, depending on if they're implemented by the central monastic body to a certain group of monasteries, or by the Nyingma tradition, right? So this duality is kind of important. Traditionally, monastic education, and this applied all the way pretty much to the 1940s and 50s, was mostly centered on ritual. What monks did in the monastery was mostly ritual. And it was structured around three main subjects. Ritual dances, which if you've been to Bhutan, you may have seen these famous festivals called the Tsechu, which are very beautiful to watch. So dance, drawing, which could be like drawing these religious symbols and drawing mandalas for ritual purposes. Like the most famous are the sand mandalas, which you might have seen in museums, or sometimes Tibetan monks go around and do perform this and chanting for ritual purposes. So they have to learn all these prayers and recite these particular rituals. If monks wanted to study like the intellectual aspect of the tradition, the philosophical aspect of the tradition, they had to pursue those independently, mostly by pursuing charismatic teachers, or by going to Tibet across the border in the north, where there was a more established institutional monastic educational tradition, right? Education was also mostly for monks in the time, right? There were barely any nuns. The tradition was almost lost. And what I'm going to say at the beginning is mostly applicable to monks, and then at the end I'll talk about the situation of nuns. Monastic education in Bhutan will see very important changes in the 20th century, where it will move from that ritual tradition to a more scholastic modern tradition. In a way, the reforms that we're going to examine in Bhutan in the 20th and now the 21st century can be framed in the larger context of what the scholar David McMahon has named Buddhist modernism. So in the 18th and 19th century, so the arrival of European colonial powers all over Asia, with many countries being directly impacted, basically being colonized, like India or Vietnam, while others suffer serious economic and cultural pressures that force them to change, like Japan or Thailand. David McMahon defines Buddhist modernism as the product of the encounter between traditional Buddhism as it was practiced in Asia with the forces of Western modernity under colonialism. So although modernity is a contested term, McMahon argued that it does capture the process of transformation and reform that the tradition underwent in the late 19th and most of the 20th century. So basically, the bottom line is that a lot of the Buddhism we know now, it's a product of this encounter with modernity, with colonial powers, right? Some scholars have also called the transformation Protestant Buddhism, which I think is very problematic, but it sort of gets to the heart of an anti-ritual, scriptural-based interpretation of Buddhism that we see all over Asia during this period. In the context of Bhutan, this process of Buddhist modernism helps explain the transformation of monastic education in Bhutan in the 20th century. And I want to highlight 4 different developments that really frame the changes that happened in Bhutan in the second half of the 20th century and now in the 21st. The first one is the one that I briefly mentioned, which is the transition from a theocracy where religious and political power was under the hands of one individual to a transition to a monarchy, where that power was separated, right? And what happened is when Bhutan transitioned from a theocracy to a monarchy, it sparked a series of social and religious reforms that had an enormous impact on monastic education in the country. And this signaled the beginning of a decline in political power of the monastic elite, of monastic institutions, and it also the beginning of a process of rethinking monastic education if it were going to be relevant in the modern era. The second is the introduction of secular education. Although there were early attempts during the first half of the 20th century, it will not be until the 1950s that the educational situation in the country would drastically change, offering for the first time to most children the possibility of receiving an education that did not involve joining a monastery. Before the 1950s, for the most part, any kid, mostly boys who wanted to receive an education, had to go to a monastery to basically learn how to read and write. Now that was open to everyone. So with free, compulsory, and inclusive education for youth from the ages from 6 to 16, families began to feel that monasteries were not the only place where their children could get an education. And most importantly, now girls could also have an opportunity to receive an education. So after some initial skepticism, the positive effect of secular education became evident, with literacy more than tripling from an estimate of 17% in 1959 to the current 66.5% of adult literacy right now. So the success of education forced the central monastic body to implement reforms to monastic education in order to modernize it, but also to keep it relevant. Basically, secular education became an existential threat to the traditional way of learning and teaching at monasteries. To oversee this transformation, the central monastic body created in 1984 this Council for Religious Affairs, which under the leadership of the Jekenpo, the figure that we saw before, was responsible for reviewing and rethinking monastic education along the lines of secular education. One way to modernize the curriculum quickly was to simply, at least initially, borrow the curriculum that Tibetans had developed already in Tibet in the late 19th century and the early 20th century in their attempts to modernize the curriculum. And then that curriculum came to the exile of India, which brings me to the third development, which was the occupation, the establishment of Tibetan monasteries in exile after the occupation of Tibet by China in 1959. So the occupation forced many Tibetan religious leaders and scholars to flee Tibet and establish themselves in the exile of India, Nepal, and also Bhutan. And with the help of the Tibetan government in exile, led by the Dalai Lama in 1960, many religious leaders from the most important Buddhist sects from Tibet replicated with significant success their monastic institutions in the exile of India, mostly, some in the north, but mostly in the south of India. And there are 2 important institutions in India that will be particularly relevant to the reforms that will happen in Bhutan, sorry. The first one is this one here, the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies, the IHTS. which was created by the Tibetan government in exile in 1967 in collaboration with the Indian government. And what this institution did was basically take the monastic curriculum in Tibet and filter it through the Indian secular system. So this institution gave monastic education a secular framework. And the other thing that it did that was very important, it opened it up to all different Buddhist traditions. While in Tibet, if you wanted to study in the Dalai Lama tradition or the Gelugpa tradition, you would have to go to that monastery. If you were studying under the Kagyu tradition, you would have to go to that monastery. This was a non-sectarian institution, and that had a very important thing. The other one is the one on the left, to your right, and that's probably the most influential, the single most influential institution to the reformed in Bhutan. And that's the monastery, the Nyingma Monastic College at Nandoli in South India, which is massive. I mean, they have thousands of monks from all the Himalayan world studying there. Nandoli brought to India a monastic curriculum that had been developed in Tibet in the late 19th century, and that had been successfully adopted by some of its more important sects, like the Sakya, the Kagyu, and offer an alternative to the more dominant Gelugpa curriculum under the leadership of the Dalai Lama. So very influential. We'll talk about that later. And the fourth and final development was the establishment of the first modern monastic college in Bhutan, and that's Tango Monastery, and in 1988 became Tango College, and then it became Tango University. And what is important about this institution is that it allows Bhutan to stop relying on monastic institutions in exile, in the Tibetan exile, and basically stop outsourcing their education. So with the establishment in 1988 of this college and then university, Bhutan became self-reliant in the way they were developing monastic education. The education of my colleague, Dorje Gelten, it's kind of very indicative of how these four forces work together. So in the fall of 1979, when Dorje was 8 years old and with no education whatsoever, he didn't know how to read and write, a man came to his house in Dagana, in a province south of Thimphu, with a ruler, like a yihad, and then he would go house by house, and if you were taller than the ruler, you had to go to the secular school. That was the efforts that the government was doing in bringing reluctant kids to the secular system. And some families wouldn't do it. Some wealthy families would bribe the person with eggs and butter, and the person will move to the next house, right? Dorje's family was not wealthy, and they decided to, you know what, let's just do this. I heard good things about the secular education system. So he basically went to, at the age of 8, for 2 years to a kindergarten, where he basically started learning how to write and read, right? There were no textbooks, and everything was done in chalk, and they had these little slabs of, yes, and he would write everything there. And he was there for 2 years. After that, he was going to continue and go to school, but his older brother was a monk, and this is a long story that's not the point here, basically brought him to the monastery. He was like, you know, just join the monastery. I know what this is about. His father actually had been a monk, so he joined the monastery. But monastic education at that time was so fragmented that Dorje had to go to all these institutions. He went to Punaka, he went to Thimphu, he went to this other place that I'll highlight later, called Dechepotang, and he basically studied ritual for 5 years. And then after those 5 years, basically at the age of 18, he joined an early monastic college. It was in Tango College, it was this other one called Pajadi, which was kind of a transitional experiment. But because he wasn't really prepared, he wasn't learning much. He started learning some of the curriculum, but then in 1988, Tango College opened, and then him and many other monks went there to study, right? The problem was, like, the first couple of years, it was a little shaky. Just imagine entering at a completely new college. And I go to new college. It can be wobbly, right? Like, everyone is trying to figure out what this is going to look like. They didn't have enough teachers. The students didn't know how it worked. and it became a little unstable. And Dorje were like, why am I staying here where the curriculum is the same as the one that they're studying here? I'll just go to India. And him and many friends just took a train and we just went to India and basically studied the whole curriculum here. So at this time, what happened is this transition, right? You have the introduction of secular education, which was gradually happening, the development of a religious education that was in its beginning with these two centers, one in exile, which was like very strong, and one in Bhutan that was in its early beginnings, right? What happened when Dorje finished his education in Namdalen, which takes 9 years, and many of the Bhutanese, those people came back to Bhutan and they were fully trained, and then they were able to get Tamil College up and running, right? So, all right. So what is the actual content of the monastic curriculum? I hope you can see that. The new educational path proposed by the central monastic body in these reforms to implement a new monastic curriculum initially took basically the Tibetan curriculum from that Tibetan monastery in exile, Namdalen. An important change that you will see in the curriculum is that the ritual education that was the traditional education of all monks, that was shoved towards the beginning and it became the equivalent of primary school. So basically, for up to 8 years, some monks do it faster. You are in this ritual college called the Lopez Ritual School, learning all the ritual training, and I'll go over that in a little bit. And then what happened is, on top of that, they built this new educational system that is a little more similar to the secular system with the equivalent of high school and then of college, right, with a BA and a master's. It's not exactly the same, but the structure became very similar. And that's what you find here. They also added recently a PhD program, which they're still working on it. And then on top of that, you can do a 3-year retreat if you wish to do so, which not everyone does. Okay, so what is the foundation of monastic learning, right? So in the modern curriculum, there's still ritual, and that happened in this sort of ritual college during the early years, up to 8 years. And an example of that was a visit we did, Dorje and I, to this monastery where he actually had studied called Dechen Potran. This is in the outskirts of Thimphu. It's here. When we visited, and this was in 2017, 2018, Dechen Potran had at that time 267 monks and 13 teachers. And monks here spent up to 8 years learning basic literacy, right? Reading and writing, as well as the ritual texts and practices of the Dupa Kagyu tradition. So when a monk enters his monastery, the first few months, and this is a curriculum for the first year, but before that, the first few years, they're basically learning basic literacy, which includes learning the alphabet, spelling, and reading. And once monastic, the monks have learned the foundation, then they move into the first grade. And in the first grade, they basically, the curriculum is divided into the root subjects, the essential subjects, and the secondary subjects. And the main subjects, the 40 main subjects, which are here, this is reflected on my notes there, basically involve memorization of daily prayers, such as the ones you will recite in every meal, during the tea offerings, as well as prayers for the Je temple, the Buddha, the Dharma, the monastic community. And then they also learn stories about the Buddha, and a little bit of English. They also learn a little bit of English. The first few grades involve mostly, again, memorizations of prayers, but also the gradual learning of instruments, which are very important, which you can see here. I'll show in a second. They also learn ritual dances, which the stitches that are very important to the monastic education in monasteries. And at the end of their training at the ritual college, monastic basically learn all of the necessary rituals essential to the daily life of a monastery, as well as the yearly ritual calendar of a Drupa Kagyu tradition. And as part of recent reforms, they learn English, because it's become basically the unofficial second language of Bhutan. And in many ways, the ritual learning is like a apprentice school. You learn by doing things, right? So you learn how to play instruments by playing instruments, right? This is a little video. So he's blowing on a bottle, so he can like learn how to breathe. So you can then play all these instruments, like that. And there's all the monks hanging out and learning how to play their instruments. And you see these a lot. Sometimes the learning doesn't happen in the classroom; they're outside just practicing all day. Sorry. After they complete their studies, they basically have to take a series of exams. And if they pass the exams, can you play the instrument? Can you do this dance? Do you know this prayer and this other prayer? Then they have to move, and this is the important change, to the second stage, which is the monastic college. Before that, that was it. That was the basic education, and you could have a very successful life as a monk, just knowing the rituals. Now, the monastic reforms have implemented that you have to be, you need to enter like the more modern education, right? So everyone has to do it. So what is this new modern curriculum, right? The one that is sort of model and the structure of secular education, but it also includes this sort of new curriculum. In Bhutan, the new curriculum, it's called the Common Era curriculum because it relies a lot on commentaries of text. It takes place in 9 years, right? 4 here, the secondary school, 3 here, and 2 here. The first year basically focuses on monastic learning, linguistic, normative, and the moral foundation that will support them through the rest of their studies, right? So they know ritual, they know basic literacy, now they have to add the ante and learn a little more sophisticated skills. In terms of normative learning, monastics here also study the basic precepts of being a monk, right? Like the kind of basic behavior, but also they learn the 37 practices of the Bodhisattva, which provides kind of with a moral foundation from the very first year. So they learn a bit of a grammar, but also a little bit of the foundations of what it means to be a monk. The second year, monks begin in earnest the study of the philosophical tradition, with learning important Mahayana texts, like the most famous probably Shantideva's The Bodhisattva Way of Life, but they also learn all sorts of philosophical texts. During the second year, they also learn the basics of Pramana or Buddhist logic, which is an important aspect of the Tibetan tradition, of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of learning to debate, philosophical debate, which they also do that. And it goes on and on. In the third year, they learn more of the traditional, very difficult Madhyamika philosophical text. Then in the next stage, they learn this sort of Abhidharma, Rasamrita training. And in the last 2 years, that's when they actually learn the basic monastic text, which they learn at the end of their training and not at the beginning. Because in the monastic tradition in the Himalayas, you become a fully ordained monk at the end of your studies, not at the beginning, because you're too young. So, in 2017, the Central Monastic Body also began a new 3-year program, Tango College, that is considered the equivalent of a PhD, and that's a very recent development. There is no tradition of original research as we understand it in modern academic settings, and they try to address that by developing a modern PhD program with the help of Bhutanese scholars who are teaching in the West. Like one of the main ones teaches in Germany. And the other thing that is important here is that it's optional, the PhD is optional, and there's the 3-year retreat, which not everyone does. And that's a place where you can practice meditation and all those ritual tantric texts during a 3-year retreat, what's called the Lopez. Okay. So that has been an overview of monastic education, mostly as it affected monks, right? So this is what monks study, and that's not only what nuns study. So I want to go, that's actually the place of the 3-year retreat, which is beautiful, inside of the mountain. A great example of the issues that nuns have faced in Bhutan in terms of not only becoming nuns, but also having access to the same monastic education as monks, is the case of Annie Wang, who's been a wonderful person to know because her life experiences basically mirror the struggles that nuns have faced over the last 40, 50 years. So when Annie Wang decided to become a nun in 1982, that's her, she could not do it in Bhutan because there was no ordination for nuns. So she had to go to India when she was 19 and become ordained. When she was, in 1982, there were only 3 nunneries in Bhutan. And most of the nuns in those nunneries were not actually ordained nuns, right? They were wearing their robes. Some of them were not even wearing the robes. So it was more of a vocational thing without following the proper path. So in order to receive an education, Annie Wang traveled to India, which she was ordained in 1984, and informally studied at several Tibetan nunneries in exile. Over the ensuing decades, many Bhutanese nuns like Annie Wang traveled to India and Nepal to basically have an education they could not receive in their own country. But their exposures to the struggles, but also to the new educational opportunities that Tibetan nuns were offering in India, inspired them to work to transform the status and education of Buddhist nuns in Bhutan. And she's a remarkable example of that, just by example. Since we don't have a lot of time, I would like to just talk during the rest of my talk about 2 main challenges faced by nuns, basically the central issue of ordination and their fight to access the curriculum. And then I will conclude by discussing creative ways nuns have circumvented those challenges by developing new educational opportunities. All right, so the issue of ordination. These were the 3 nunneries. So let's start with the issue of ordination, right? So a key issue at the heart of that Bhutanese nuns face is the fact that they don't lack full ordination, and in many cases even what's called novice ordination. So in Buddhism, monastic ordination for monks happen in 2 stages. When you're very young, you become a novice monk, and it takes basically 10 vows. And when you're of age, usually 17, 18, 20, you receive the full vows, which is 253 for the monastic tradition. Nuns have 3 stages traditionally. They also become novice nuns, which is the 10 basic vows: do not kill, do not steal, no sexual intercourse, etc. And then you have 2 other stages. One is a probationary stage of 2 years, which is like a nun in training. And then the last stage is when you become a fully ordained nun. The problem is in many Buddhist countries, because the cultural constraints and historical developments, those 2 later developments have disappeared. Right? So in many Buddhist countries, in Southeast Asia and Central Asia, nuns can only be novice nuns, right? And that is a problem because not being fully ordained puts nuns at a disadvantage, right? Not only in terms of protections, but also they don't have access to the curriculum. Because if you want to study the curriculum, which includes the study of the monastic vows, you need to be ordained. So if you don't have the vows, you cannot study. So this is kind of weird catch-22, where you cannot study because you're not ordained. But it's like, but I cannot be ordained because the tradition, we lost it, right? So that's been kind of an issue. In the context of the modern era, and particularly in Himalayan countries, Nyingma institutions, so the ones that are not the official state religion of Bhutan, have actually been more progressive, mostly because of the connection to the Indian communities. And they have been very willing to give ordination, novice ordination to nuns, no problem. And in some cases, although this is an issue of tension, even full ordination through alternative routes. The central monastic body in Bhutan, the one that controls the Drupa Kagyu, has been very conservative. And this is remarkable, right? Most nuns in Bhutan were not ordained at all till 2014, right? So just barely 10 years ago, right? Less than that, most nuns in Bhutan were not ordained in the country, not even as novice nuns. which basically gave them no rights in many ways. This happened so in 2014, the Bhutan Foundation, which I'll mention a little bit, which is a non-governmental organization, organized, it's a sneaky way of doing it, an international Buddhist conference in Bhutan, where the issue of ordination was really not central. But they used that to basically bring all these experts to Bhutan and basically tell the central monastic body, look, this is not right, this is not fair, we need to change it. And the central monastic body, to their credit, did it. And they became, like in the central monastic body, they became ordained in 2014, and now it's going for transformation. Let me see. Okay, so I'll just go quickly. This was the first ordination here. This is actually a Bhutanese nun who is fully ordained through the Chinese system. She's one of two in her nunnery. Not all the other ones wanted to do it. Okay, so a couple of things. So one is the issue of ordination, which has been solved little by little, right? The other one is the fight that nuns have to do to access the curriculum. And again, there is this dual parallel tracks. The Nyingma nunneries, the ones that are independent and not controlled by the central monastic government, like there's this one in Filipina, they've been very progressive and they've been introducing little by little the monastic curriculum. They don't have the same curriculum as the monks because the lack of coordination, but they've been progressively introducing it. So in 1998, Sisina, this nunnery at the outskirts of Paro, right? Tipu, the capital, is right here, right? No, Paro, Tipu, somewhere. They introduced in 98. There's that other nunnery. This is really short. There's another Pemantolin, which is in the Central Valley. Also introduced the monastery. But just so you can see the challenges, right? The nunneries had to build their own monastic college. Just imagine, as a college student, during the day, you have to build your own nunnery, your own monastic college, and then in the afternoon, you have to study. Monks never had to do this, right? So the challenges that nuns faced were much higher than the one that monks had to do, right? The monks were mostly provided by the central monastic body. The nuns is like, well, you can do it, but you have to do it by yourself, right? So this is the nunnery, the monastic college. There's an interesting example of a nunnery from the Drupa Kali tradition, and it's this one of Pilabomba. And it's a nunnery that I visited with my colleague, George Gelsen, and we talked to some of the nuns, like this one here. And what was interesting, she told us the story, is that, you know, she's a Drupa Kali nun, she is embedded in this hierarchical system, a system that didn't want them to have access to that education or was fighting them. But she was like, I know all these other nuns, it's a small country after all, in these other nunneries, these Nyingma nunneries, who are having access to education. Why can't I do it? And she went with another nun to the capital, called to the central monastic body, and basically said, I want to study. And they were like, okay. And she went back, and 3 months later, they sent a teacher, a male teacher, and they started studying the curriculum. But it was so improvised that after 4 years of doing this under the radar, the central monastic body, because every year they have to take exams, the central monastic body was like, wait a second. They are actually just doing the same curriculum as the monks, and they can't do it because they're not fully ordained. So they told them, you have to stop. And the nuns were like, we're not stopping. And the 5th year and the 6th year, they kept taking the test. And the central monastic body was like, you have to stop. And they were like, we're not stopping. The problem was the last year. The last year, the 9th year, when they had to take the test, that's when the central monastic body said, like, can't take the exam. I'm not going to let you, because that means you fulfill the curriculum, and that means you are taking a test in the final year about the actual monastic rules you're not supposed to take because you're not fully ordained. And it became this huge tension in the monastery, which she was telling us, was crying because it was like, why can't I do it? I studied the same thing as the monks. I spent the same amount of time. Why don't they let me prove it that I can just do the same thing? And the answer is no, right? And that's what sparked for the central monastic body the institution of 4 different nunneries, where now they have a set curriculum that is similar, but not the same as monks. So there's how to step that. And the last thing I want to mention, and I'll finish with that, is this very interesting organization called the Bhutan Foundation that was founded in 2009. Right? 2009 by Patrick Damo, who is this incredible woman here, who basically saw the issues that nuns were having in the country and decided that, okay, we're pushing for monastic education, for monastic ordination, but because there's all this resistance, she was like, you know what, I'm just going to do something completely different too. So I'm fighting this front, but then I'm going to build a new educational institution, and it's called the Training and Research Center Project. And it's not a nunnery, it's not a monastery, it's not controlled by the central monastic body, it's not controlled by any monastic institution, but it's run by nuns. It's non-sectarian, and nuns can come here, and it was opened last year, throughout the day of COVID. And basically here they do all sorts of interesting training in what it's called more socially engaged Buddhism. They're trying to engage with some of the problems, social problems that the community has, and the nuns are trying to address it, right? And it just started, but it was a remarkable way of circumventing the tensions that the nuns have to face by offering an alternative path. So, very excited to see what they do. So basically, just to conclude here, right? So as I hope my talk has made obvious, the transformation of monastic education in Bhutan can be explained through a series of factors connected to what Manuel called Buddhist modernism. So the political transition from a theocracy into a monarchy diminished the power the monastic institutions had in the country. The introduction and success of secular education made monasticism less appealing option for families since they could not send their children, boys and girls, to get an education that would prepare them for the challenges of the 20th and now the 21st century. So the institutional response was to introduce this sort of new modern curriculum that transformed monastic education from what was mostly a ritual affair into a modern educational system that prepares monks to, challenges that they're facing right now. Yeah, so I'm just going to drop it there so we have time for questions. So I just hope this talk just kind of offers a little glimpse to the reforms in monastic education, but also the different challenges faced by monks and nuns. Thank you for being here. Yeah.
The education.
So if you're part of the central monastic body, you get paid by the central monastic body. So it's an institutional support, right? Although, especially if you're a monk, a lot of the nuns are not supported by the government, right? So it's a little more challenging. So they have to use their own funds to do it. And in the Nyingma tradition, these other non-institutional, not hierarchical, sometimes the families have to support it. But now there is a lot of fundraisers and a lot of monastic institutions just cover the expenses of the monks.
So it's not like parents have to pay for children.
No. Also, sometimes there's an obligation you contribute to food or some expenses for them, right? But from the central monastic body, they get a stipend. I can remember it's not a lot, but they get some money every month. But it's
So when they managed to build this wonderful institution, was that fundraising that they had?
There was a lot of fundraising, money came from a lot of places. She had the support of one of the Queen Mothers, which usually the previous king of Bhutan, in case you didn't know this, was married to 4 sisters. So the present king is only married to 1. But the previous king was married to 4 sisters, so there is all these Queen Mothers now. And it's one of the Queen Mothers who supported the project. But the money, it doesn't come from the government. It's through she's a remarkable woman. It's impressive what she's been doing for nuns all over the country. Yeah.
Has the President Queen taken any position on nuns versus monks?
So that's a really, I think a lot of, so there's a lot of support for the plea of the nuns, but it's also a very traditional culture, right? So traditionally, nuns are not fully ordained. So it's not as easy. Someone like the Dalai Lama, who has an enormous clout, he's supportive of that, right? But at the same time, he's not the Pope, right? There's no central hierarchical figure in the Himalayan Buddhist tradition or the Buddhist tradition as a whole. So even if there is support, the institutions are very resistant, right? Monks have a lot of power, right? Have a lot of institutional power, so they don't want to keep that out, right? And sometimes they're very supportive. I talk to officials who are incredibly supportive. For example, when this nun from Quilagompa was telling me it's not fair, a monk from the central monastic body, privately told me, it's not that we don't want them to do it, but it takes a lot of time to get sort of trained in this curriculum, which was a little condescending, right, to be fair. But he was saying it just takes time, right, for everyone to get on board. So the Queen Mother might be supportive, but that doesn't mean that you can just, from the top down, change the institution. Yeah.
We have an online question for you, and someone wanted to know that if you could explain very quickly the basic difference between Bhutanese Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, and if you could just kind of begin this very quickly and explain that.
So Bhutanese Buddhism is sort of part of this Himalayan Buddhism, what's traditionally called Tibetan Buddhism, but the more time I spend in Bhutan, it doesn't sound fair, right? So it's sort of Himalayan form of Tantric Buddhism. And it's quite different from Theravada Buddhism, right? Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia, for example, in the Theravada tradition, is very heavily monastic, right? And the monastic community plays a very important role. But the monastic rules are slightly different, like from the Theravada tradition to the Tibetan Bhutanese tradition. The Tibetan Bhutanese tradition is also tantric, so they study a set of texts, ritual texts that are very different from the type of texts you would learn in the Theravada tradition, right? So I don't know. There's plenty of differences, So this process of Buddhist modernism that I mentioned, in many ways, brought a lot of these other Buddhist traditions kind of closer than they would be traditionally. Like a couple hundred years ago, a monk from Bhutan dropping Thailand might have more trouble recognizing what's happening there. But through the process of Buddhist modernism and the sort of interconnectedness of all these Buddhist traditions, there is more of an approximation now of their understanding of it.
Sure. Question also about your not really methodology, but your process of collecting some of this data and working with like a local scholar. And do you think that does that change your access significantly working with somebody on that local, a local scholar? Or do you think is that more of a just professional consideration for you guys, or do you want to work together because you're interested in the same topic, or is that something that provides you with a little bit more access than you think you might have alone, coming into the country, regardless how long you've lived in the region, how well you speak the language?
Yeah, so one of the things that was very interesting, when I lived in Nepal for 6 years, I was the co-director of a study work program, that is a school for international training. And we would go to Bhutan, and we would take students to Bhutan. And one of the things that became very clear from very early on is like they are very wary of people just going to Bhutan and taking, quote unquote, taking stuff and just leaving, like scholars, academics. They're really, and it's very fair into the process of reciprocity, right? Like happy to help, but how can you help? How can you contribute, right? So that became very clear to me during my first few trips to Bhutan. So when I started being interested in developing this project, I reached out to some of my friends, and from the very beginning, I was like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to work with a local scholar. And that's been very interesting, right? Because we asked very different questions. He was a monk, right? I wasn't, right? And that brings a unique perspective. And also, the kind of questions I might ask, they're not the questions that he would ask, right? And that also has helped me kind of settle a little bit. Like I just kind of go there for a month and a half, and just ask all these questions I'm on a schedule, because that's not how it works, right? So I've learned to sort of adapt a little bit the way I'm learning, the way I'm asking questions, but also the kind of contributions, right? Like it's not only my voice to this project. Like, I mean, I have what I think is a very strong kind of approach to it, but over time, I've also learned to see that you need to open it up to different voices, and in this case, it's voices of a Bhutanese scholar, right? So that's been a very interesting learning opportunity. And we've done, written articles, we're working on a book together, and there's no doubt, intellectually and academically, it's been the most significant experience I've had doing research, right? Because you have to negotiate all these cultural values, but it's been incredibly, rich experience. Yeah.
So when we were there, we learned that a fair amount of nuns and monks joined because their parents temporarily couldn't afford to keep them at home. Do you see that increasing or decreasing, and also do you see a change in terms of how many stay in the monastery for life, for a long time?
Yes, and traditionally, there was this thing, an official thing called the monk tax, which basically every family would have to give a son or two to the monastic community. And that sort of was a feeder into monasteries that maintained their institutional strength, because they always had this pipeline of kids coming to the monasteries. With the emergence of secular education, that dramatically not stopped, but changed, because before the 1950s, pretty much, if you knew of a brilliant kid, or you wanted to give your son an opportunity, the monastery was a great way, because through the monastery, the social hierarchies were a little fragmented. They were still, who came from a wealthy family or not, still kind of matter, but the monastic training will be like we do in many, sometimes in the United States, right? It's a ladder that helps you socially. But with secular education, that was not necessary anymore. You can send your kids to a secular school. So that has definitely impacted. A lot of the establishment would tell us all the time, we just don't get the great students we used to get before, right? Now I teach at a college and I hear that all the time too, right? Like all their faculty are like, they were so much better, right? So I think there is a bias there. But you would hear that. And the other thing is true, like particularly in nunneries, you would find there would be a place where parents who can support their kids or that come from like harsh home environments, that would be a place where they can be safely protected, right? And get an education. So there's a little bit of that, Some monasteries and nunneries, particularly nunneries, have been more creative where they would like take girls without the expectation that they're going to be nuns. They're like, okay, there's no school here, just come here to study, things like that. Right? So they'd be more flexible. Sorry.
You answered my question.
Sure.
I always try to be really careful when I'm traveling, not to be an ugly American. With our tour, went to a number of different monasteries, and I kept noticing there's just tremendous amount of chanting and ritual, and that the monks would, go to a home to perform a ritual. That was kind of how they made their living, or whatever. And I kept looking for the spiritual side of it, that there was this ritual side that was fine, but I was looking for the spiritual side. So I asked our guide to try not to make me sound rude, but to ask, I had this vision from the West of monks and mountains and, doing, connecting with the divine. And here these people are doing rituals, and so I just asked, could this monk talk about that a little bit to me? And he said there were essentially, well, this is how it got translated back to me. There were two different kinds of monks, and that some did rituals and some did, mountain vision
Yeah.
kind of thing. And it seemed like because our guide didn't have the language, I used the distinction of an occupation and a vocation.
Yeah.
And after we went back and forth a little bit, what that difference might be, that seemed to be a difference that the monks were communicating. Could you just talk a little bit
Yeah,
about
so
that?
that goes to this issue of Buddhist modernism, right? So I tell my students this all the time. I grew up in Spain. I grew up in a Catholic culture, right? Particularly in a time when there was not a lot of diversity. Everyone was a Catholic pretty much, and I went to Catholic school. And, my grandmother, my mom, who I think is watching, she doesn't speak English, but, reading the Bible was not a thing growing up, right? It's a very Protestant thing that comes from the Protestant Reformation, where rituals are bad and reading the Bible is good, right? And a lot of Buddhist countries, ritual is religion, right? Like practicing ritual is religion. And I think there is a tension when we are trained, even I'm Catholic, right? And so Western mentality of like, where is the spiritual side? Where is all of that? And when we go to this country, there's that resistance, right? And it's there to a certain extent, but ritual is one of the most important things about all these monks do. That's how they earn a living for the most part, right? They go to places, funerals, like, the blessing of a new home or a baby, and that's how they make a living. The impact of this new monastic curriculum is probably still years in the making, right? Where you're going to have a class of monks who, on top of the ritual learning, are being more trained in this scholastic tradition. But said that scholastic tradition is also very unique. It's not what we do at New College or University of Florida or institutions, right? It's a different type of learning, right? So you will find teachers who do retreats and talk about meditation. You find all of that, right? But it's not naturally the way they will approach like these sort of religious questions for the most part, right? It's changing. Yeah.
But I point out too that even those monks that go into the mountain and do this are engaged in ritual.
Yeah.
And those are highly ritualized kinds of process. And so, I think it's important not to Protestanize, Asian religion in this sense and assume that there's somehow people who are bogged down in ritual, right? I.e. Catholic kind of component of that. And then there's people who, kind of read the original sources. There are some small relationship with it. That's not a distinction that's being made at all.
Yes.
So I think it's, even meditating is ritualistic in many ways.
Yeah.
And even the act of reading scripture and sutra can be ritualized in that sense as well.
Yeah.
So,
The people who do those 3-year retreats, they basically have a set list of text, and they have to just repeat and repeat 100,000 times, literally 108,000 times. These practices again and again and again. So it's not always that intellectual process that we think of, right? I agree. The issue with the reading scripture, right? The whole curriculum in the Bhutanese tradition, the Tibetan tradition, is mostly through commentaries. That's why it's called the commentarial tradition. They don't read the original scripture for the most part. They read a commentary on the original scripture. Sometimes they read a commentary on an original scripture, right? Which is what, at school a lot of kids do. You read a text. You don't read sometimes a primary source. You read a 3-page summary and discuss it, right? So they do that a lot. If some of you have been, but if you have an opportunity to go to Bhutan, it's an amazing, it's really an amazing, beautiful country, right? So hopefully what I discussed today helps sort of demystify some of the things that you might see there. Yeah, totally worth it.